Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something genuinely disturbing. Not medieval combat or crusader theatrics, but something far more insidious. We're talking about Victorian England, where the deadliest weapon wasn't a sword or a lance, it was a makeup brush. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you're into dark historical deep dives, and subscribe if you want more of this content. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and whether this Victorian horror show sounds familiar to any beauty standards you've seen today. Now settle in, maybe grab some water, because this story is about what happens when an entire society convinces women to slowly poison themselves and calls it beauty. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to Victorian England, where cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, but rather somewhere between suspicious and potentially fatal. This is the story of how an entire society's deranged approach to bathing, makeup, and basic sanitation transformed perfectly healthy women into pallid, trembling ghosts of themselves, all in the name of beauty, modesty, and a truly staggering misunderstanding of how the human body works. Let's set the scene. It's 1850, and you're a respectable middle-class woman in London. You wake up in a bedroom that hasn't been properly aired out in months because miasma theory, the reigning scientific paradigm of the day, insists that night air causes disease. Never mind that you've been marinating in your own carbon dioxide for 8 hours. The real danger, according to every doctor worth his leeches, is that terrifying outside breeze. You haven't had a proper bath in weeks. Not because you're lazy, mind you, but because bathing is considered medically dangerous. The Victorians genuinely believed that water opened your pores, which in turn opened pathways for diseases to march directly into your bloodstream like tiny invisible armies. Doctors published earnest treatises warning that frequent bathing could cause everything from consumption to moral degeneracy. One physician in 1851 wrote that bathing more than once a month could weaken the vital forces and render the body susceptible to miasmatic influences. Translation: getting clean might literally kill you. So instead of bathing, you engage in what Victorians called a dry toilet. This involves standing in your undergarments, dabbing yourself with a damp cloth in the least offensive areas, and calling it a day. Your armpits, untouched, your feet, festering in boots you haven't removed in 3 days. The area between your legs. We don't speak of such things in polite society, which means we certainly don't clean them. But here's where it gets truly spectacular. You might not be bathing, but you absolutely must look like a porcelain doll brought to life. Victorian beauty standards demanded pale, translucent skin, the kind that suggested you'd never seen sunlight or engaged in anything as vulgar as physical labor. The problem, of course, is that your actual skin, unwashed and suffocating under layers of wool and cotton, is probably breaking out in rashes, boils, and a general rebellion against your lifestyle choices. Enter the Victorian cosmetics industry, which operated on the principle that if something is poisonous, it must be effective. To achieve that coveted deathly pallor, women turned to lead-based face powders and paints. Yes, lead. The same substance that caused brain damage in Roman aristocrats, and would later be banned from gasoline, because it made an entire generation of Americans measurably stupider. The most popular product was called rouge, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that created a smooth, pale paste. Women would slather this toxic concoction all over their faces, necks, and exposed chest areas. It worked brilliantly. In the sense that it did make them pale, it also gradually poisoned them, causing headaches, hair loss, tooth decay, muscle paralysis, and in severe cases, death. But hey, at least they looked fashionable while dying. The lead wasn't even the worst of it. To achieve rosy cheeks and red lips, women used vermilion, a pigment made from mercury sulfide. Mercury, as you might recall from your basic chemistry education, or that one weird kid in middle school who broke a thermometer, is spectacularly toxic. Absorbed through the skin, mercury causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and something called erethism, a syndrome characterized by extreme shyness, irritability, and tremors. In severe cases, mercury poisoning led to psychosis and death. So picture this: a Victorian woman at a ball, her face painted white with lead, her cheeks and lips rouged with mercury, slowly being poisoned from the outside in. She's not bathed in weeks. She's wearing a corset laced so tightly that her internal organs have rearranged themselves into a new, deeply unhappy configuration. She's sweating into multiple layers of unwashed clothing, and the sweat is mixing with the lead and mercury on her skin, creating a toxic soup that's being absorbed directly into her bloodstream. But wait, there's more. Because pale skin was prized, women went to extraordinary lengths to avoid tanning. They carried parasols everywhere, wore bonnets that could double as satellite dishes, and in some cases drank diluted arsenic to achieve an even paler complexion from the inside out. Yes, arsenic, the poison of choice for Victorian murderers, was marketed as a beauty treatment called arsenic complexion wafers. The advertisements promised clear, pale skin and a brilliant complexion. They delivered on the pale part, mostly because arsenic literally damages your skin cells and can cause your skin to take on a translucent waxy quality. This is because you're dying. The arsenic tablets were wildly popular despite, or perhaps because of, their tendency to kill the user. Women took them daily, gradually accumulating toxic levels of arsenic in their systems. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning include weakness, nausea, skin lesions, but eventually organ failure. But in the short term, arsenic did make women pale, gave them a fragile, delicate appearance, and suppressed their appetites, leading to the fashionably frail figure that Victorian society adored. Now, let's talk about hair. Victorian women prized long, luxurious hair. But here's the problem: if you're not bathing regularly, your scalp becomes a biological disaster zone. The sebaceous glands, which produce oil to protect your hair and scalp, go into overdrive when they're not regularly cleaned. This creates a greasy, itchy mess that attracts dirt, dust, and in some unfortunate cases, lice. The Victorian solution to greasy hair wasn't to wash it more often. That would be far too sensible. Instead, women used dry shampoos made from powdered starch, clay, or even powdered orris root. These products absorbed some of the oil, but they also accumulated in the hair, mixed with dirt and dead skin cells, and created a crusty residue that could only be fully removed by, you guessed it, washing with water, which Victorian women were terrified to do because of those pesky open pores. When women did wash their hair, which might happen once every few months, they used harsh soaps made from lye and animal fats. These soaps stripped the hair of all its natural oils, leaving it dry, brittle, and prone to breakage. To combat this, women applied various oils and pomades, many of which contained lead, mercury, or other toxic substances. One popular hair darkener called Grecian water was essentially a lead acetate solution that could cause lead poisoning through scalp absorption. The combination of infrequent washing, harsh soaps, and toxic hair products meant that many Victorian women experienced hair loss, scalp infections, and in some cases baldness. This was often attributed to brain fever or nervous exhaustion, rather than the obvious culprit. They were literally poisoning themselves in the name of beauty. Let's move down the body to discuss undergarments, because this is where things get truly horrifying. Victorian women wore multiple layers of clothing, starting with a chemise, a long cotton or linen undergarment that was meant to protect the skin from the rougher outer garments. In theory, you were supposed to change and wash your chemise regularly. In practice, many women wore the same chemise for weeks at a time. Why? Partly because washing clothes was an enormous undertaking in the Victorian era. There were no washing machines, no running hot water in many homes, and laundry day was an exhausting, all-day affair that involved hauling water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing clothes by hand with harsh lye soap, and then hanging everything to dry. For working-class women who already spent 12-hour days in factories or doing domestic labor, finding the time and energy to do laundry weekly was nearly impossible. But even wealthy women, who had servants to do their laundry, often went weeks without changing their undergarments. This was partly due to modesty. Taking off your chemise meant being briefly naked, even if you were alone in your bedroom, and Victorian morality suggested that even looking at your own naked body was somewhat scandalous. The result was that Victorian women wore undergarments that were soaked with sweat, oils from their skin, menstrual blood, and various bodily secretions for extended periods. This created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Skin infections, rashes, and yeast infections were endemic among Victorian women. But these conditions were rarely discussed or properly treated, because mentioning anything below the waist was considered deeply inappropriate. Speaking of things below the waist, let's address the elephant in the room: menstruation. The Victorian approach to menstrual hygiene was to essentially pretend it didn't exist. Women used cloth rags, which they would rinse out and reuse, often for years. These rags were washed with cold water, because hot water was believed to set stains, and were often not fully dried before being used again. The health implications were staggering. Damp, partially cleaned menstrual rags became breeding grounds for bacteria. Many Victorian women suffered from chronic pelvic inflammatory disease, urinary tract infections, and other reproductive health issues that were never properly diagnosed or treated. Doctors of the era believed that menstruation was a form of purging bad blood, and that any interference with the process could cause the retained blood to back up into the brain, causing insanity. So even when women did seek medical help for menstrual-related health issues, they were often told that their problems were psychological rather than physical. The lack of proper menstrual hygiene, combined with tight corsets that restricted blood flow and compressed the reproductive organs, led to a host of health problems. Many Victorian women experienced irregular periods, severe cramping, and chronic pelvic pain. These symptoms were often dismissed as hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any woman who complained about literally anything. The hysteria diagnosis is worth examining in detail because it perfectly encapsulates Victorian medicine's approach to women's health: blame the patient. If a woman complained of headaches, fatigue, irritability, or physical pain, doctors would diagnose her with hysteria and prescribe rest, isolation, and in some cases institutionalization. The possibility that her symptoms might be caused by lead poisoning, mercury exposure, malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, or chronic infection was rarely considered. The rest cure, popularized by physician Silas Ware Mitchell, was a common treatment for hysteria. Women diagnosed with this condition were confined to bed for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any mental or physical activity. They were fed a diet of milk and red meat, often force-fed if they refused to eat, and were essentially isolated from all human contact, except for their doctor and nurse. The rest cure was supposed to restore women's health by allowing their overtaxed nervous systems to recover. In reality, it often made things worse. The enforced inactivity led to muscle atrophy, the isolation caused or worsened depression and anxiety, and the lack of mental stimulation was psychologically devastating. Many women who underwent the rest cure emerged from it in worse condition than when they started, which doctors interpreted as evidence that their hysteria was particularly severe, rather than evidence that the treatment was fundamentally flawed. But here's the truly maddening part: many of the symptoms attributed to hysteria were actually caused by the toxic cosmetics, lack of hygiene, restrictive clothing, and poor nutrition that characterized Victorian women's lives. A woman who complained of tremors, weakness, and confusion wasn't suffering from a mysterious nervous condition. She was suffering from mercury poisoning from her makeup. A woman who experienced chronic pain, digestive issues, and difficulty breathing wasn't hysterical. She was being slowly crushed to death by her corset. Let's talk about corsets in more detail, because these torture devices masquerading as undergarments deserve their own special circle of hell. The Victorian ideal was an hourglass figure with a waist so small that it suggested the woman had never eaten a meal or possessed internal organs. To achieve this look, women wore corsets that were laced as tightly as possible, often with the help of a maid or family member who would brace their foot against the woman's back for leverage. The immediate effects of tight lacing were difficulty breathing, restricted movement, and in some cases, fainting. Victorian literature is full of delicate ladies who swoon at the slightest provocation, and this wasn't just dramatic writing. These women were literally suffocating in their underwear. The restricted breathing meant their brains and organs weren't getting adequate oxygen, which caused dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. The long-term effects were even worse. Chronic tight lacing deformed the ribcage, compressed the lungs, and displaced internal organs. The liver, stomach, and intestines were pushed downward and inward, leading to chronic digestive problems. Many Victorian women suffered from constipation, acid reflux, and severe abdominal pain, all direct results of their fashion choices. The reproductive organs were particularly affected by tight lacing. The uterus, ovaries, and other pelvic organs were compressed and displaced, leading to painful menstruation, difficulty becoming pregnant, and complicated pregnancies. Many Victorian women died in childbirth, and while some of these deaths were due to infection or hemorrhaging, others were caused by the fact that their pelvises had been deformed by years of corset wearing, making it physically impossible to deliver a baby naturally. But even knowing all this, Victorian society insisted that corsets were not only necessary but beneficial. Doctors wrote articles claiming that corsets supported the weak female spine and prevented women from injuring themselves through overexertion. The underlying assumption was that women were inherently fragile and needed external support to function. The fact that this external support was causing organ damage, respiratory problems, and chronic pain was conveniently ignored. The combination of toxic makeup, unwashed skin, restrictive clothing, and poor hygiene created a perfect storm of health problems. Victorian women suffered from chronic infections, skin conditions, respiratory issues, digestive problems, and neurological damage. Many were in constant pain. Most were malnourished, because tight corsets made eating uncomfortable, and Victorian beauty standards prized a frail, delicate appearance that could only be achieved through semi-starvation. And yet, Victorian society looked at these pale, trembling, chronically ill women and decided that this was what femininity should look like. The Victorian ideal woman was fragile, weak, prone to fainting, and in need of male protection. The fact that women only fit this ideal because they were being slowly poisoned by their beauty routine was either not recognized or not considered important. The clothing situation extended beyond corsets. Victorian women wore multiple layers of heavy, unwashed fabric. A typical outfit included a chemise, drawers, a corset cover, multiple petticoats, sometimes as many as 6 or 7, a dress, and various accessories. The total weight of these garments could exceed 20 pounds. In summer, women were walking around in what amounted to a portable sauna, sweating profusely into clothes that were rarely washed and never properly ventilated. The petticoats deserve special mention because they were often made of horsehair or starched cotton, both of which were scratchy, uncomfortable, and created friction against the skin. This constant friction, combined with the sweat, dirt, and bacteria accumulating in the layers of unwashed clothing, led to chronic skin irritation and infections. Many Victorian women had permanent scarring on their legs and lower body from these friction-related injuries. The footwear was equally problematic. Victorian shoes were often too small, because small feet were considered dainty and feminine. Women would cram their feet into boots and shoes that were sometimes 2 sizes too small, leading to bunions, corns, ingrown toenails, and chronic foot pain. The shoes were also rarely removed. Many Victorian women slept in their stockings and only removed their boots for bathing, which, remember, happened once a month if they were particularly fastidious. The constant pressure and restriction on the feet, combined with poor circulation due to tight lacing, led to a host of foot problems. Bunions became so severe that they deformed the entire foot structure. Corns became infected. Ingrown toenails led to serious infections that could spread to the bone. In some extreme cases, women developed gangrene in their toes from the combination of poor circulation and chronic infection. But vanity demanded small feet and a delicate appearance, so women hobbled around in too small shoes, their feet slowly being destroyed inside boots they hadn't removed in days. The pain was considered a normal part of being a woman. Just another cross to bear in the name of beauty and respectability. Let's return to the face and discuss the daily routine of applying toxic makeup. Victorian women would start by covering their face, neck, and chest with the lead-based white paint. They would apply it thickly, building up layers to achieve that coveted porcelain look. The paint was often mixed with other substances, including zinc oxide, which added an extra level of opacity, and various oils to help it adhere to the skin. Once the white base was applied, women would use the mercury-based vermilion to add color to their cheeks and lips. The trick was to make it look natural, as if the color came from within rather than from a pot of poison. This required careful blending and a light touch, both of which were difficult to achieve when your hands were trembling from mercury-induced nerve damage. The eyebrows and eyelashes were often enhanced with coal, which sounds harmless until you learn that Victorian coal often contained antimony, lead, or lampblack made from burning animal fat. These substances could cause eye irritation, infections, and in some cases, blindness. But bushy eyebrows were unfashionable, so women would pluck them to thin lines, or even shave them off entirely, and paint them back on with lead-based paint. The eyes themselves were treated with belladonna drops to dilate the pupils. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, is a powerful poison that affects the nervous system. The dilated pupils it produced were considered attractive because they gave women a dreamy, romantic appearance. They also caused blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and could lead to permanent eye damage with repeated use. But beauty is pain, quite literally in this case. All of this makeup was applied in the morning and left on all day, sometimes for multiple days, if the woman wasn't planning to go out and didn't want to waste product. The lead, mercury, and other toxins were in constant contact with the skin, being absorbed directly into the bloodstream. The skin underneath the makeup was suffocating, unable to breathe or regulate temperature properly, leading to breakouts, rashes, and infections. And when it was finally time to remove the makeup, Victorian women used cold cream, which was essentially a mixture of oil and wax. This would smear the makeup around, but not fully remove it. Traces of the toxic substances would remain on the skin, working their way deeper into the pores overnight. Over weeks, months, and years, these women were accumulating toxic levels of heavy metals in their systems. The symptoms of chronic, heavy metal poisoning are varied and insidious. They start with fatigue, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. As the poisoning progresses, victims experience muscle weakness, tremors, and coordination problems. Their skin takes on a greyish pallor, not the attractive white they were aiming for, but a sickly, corpse-like hue. Hair falls out in clumps, teeth decay and fall out. The gums turn black from lead accumulation. In advanced cases, victims experience severe neurological symptoms. They have difficulty walking, their hands shake so badly they can barely feed themselves, and they suffer from hallucinations and delusions. Some become paranoid and violent. Others sink into deep depressions. Many die slowly, their organs failing one by one as the accumulated toxins destroy their bodies from the inside out. And throughout all of this, Victorian doctors scratched their heads and diagnosed these women with hysteria, neurasthenia, or some other vague nervous condition. The possibility that the cosmetics were to blame was occasionally raised, but it was quickly dismissed. After all, these products had been used for centuries. If they were dangerous, surely someone would have noticed by now. Except people had noticed. There were warnings about the dangers of lead, based cosmetics going back to ancient Greece. Elizabethan courtiers had died from lead poisoning caused by their white face paint. The connection between cosmetics and illness was well documented. But the cosmetics industry was profitable, and Victorian society was more concerned with maintaining appearances than protecting women's health. The dental situation in Victorian England deserves its own chapter of horrors. The combination of sugar consumption, which increased dramatically during the Victorian era, and absolute neglect of dental hygiene, meant that most Victorians had terrible teeth. By the time a woman reached her 30s, she might have lost half her teeth to decay or infection. By 50, many women had no natural teeth left. The Victorian approach to tooth care was sporadic at best. Toothbrushes existed but were made from animal hair, usually boar bristles, and were expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford them. The poor cleaned their teeth, if they cleaned them at all, by rubbing them with a cloth. Toothpaste as we know it didn't exist. Instead, Victorians used tooth powders made from chalk, crushed brick, or in some truly horrifying cases, crushed cuttlefish bones. Some of these tooth powders contained harsh abrasives that wore down the tooth enamel, leading to increased sensitivity and decay. Others contained toxic substances like mercury or lead, because apparently the Victorians believed that if something was poisonous, it must be effective for something. The real problem, though, was that most Victorians simply didn't clean their teeth regularly. The wealthy might brush once a day, usually in the morning. The middle class brushed occasionally when they remembered. The poor never brushed at all. The result was endemic tooth decay, gum disease, and chronic oral infections. These oral infections weren't just painful. They were dangerous. Bacteria from infected teeth and gums can enter the bloodstream and cause serious health problems, including heart infections, organ abscesses, and sepsis. In the days before antibiotics, a severe tooth infection could easily be fatal. And yet, most Victorians walked around with mouths full of rotting teeth, chronic abscesses, and infected gums, because dental care was expensive, painful, and not considered a priority. When a tooth became too painful to ignore, the solution was extraction. Victorian dentistry was a brutal affair. There was no effective anesthesia for most of the period, though nitrous oxide and ether were introduced in the 1840s and gradually became more common. Extractions were performed with pliers, like instruments called forceps, and the dentist would essentially grab the tooth and yank it out with as much force as necessary. The pain was excruciating. The risk of infection was high, and once a tooth was extracted, it was gone forever. There were no dental implants. False teeth were available, but were expensive, uncomfortable, and often didn't fit properly. Many women simply learned to live with gaps in their smiles, which made eating difficult and added to their malnourished, unhealthy appearance. The combination of poor dental hygiene and toxic cosmetics was particularly devastating. Lead poisoning causes a distinctive blue, black line along the gums called a Burton line. Many Victorian women had this telltale sign of lead toxicity, but it was often attributed to poor oral hygiene rather than cosmetic poisoning. Meanwhile, mercury poisoning causes excessive salivation, gum recession, and tooth loss. Combined with actual tooth decay from poor dental care, Victorian women's mouths were disaster zones. Let's discuss nutrition, or rather the lack thereof. The Victorian diet, particularly for middle and upper class women, was terrible. The ideal woman was supposed to have a tiny waist and delicate appetite. Eating heartily was considered unladylike. Women were expected to pick at their food, eat small portions, and never appear hungry or enthusiastic about eating. This social pressure to eat like a bird, combined with corsets that made eating uncomfortable, meant that many Victorian women were chronically malnourished. They weren't getting enough calories, and what they did eat was often lacking in essential nutrients. The Victorian diet was heavy on white bread, potatoes, and meat, but light on fresh fruits and vegetables. Vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was common even among the wealthy. Symptoms include fatigue, weakness, swollen and bleeding gums, and skin lesions. In severe cases, old wounds can reopen, bones become fragile, and the victim eventually dies from internal bleeding. Victorian women suffering from scurvy were often misdiagnosed with consumption or other wasting diseases. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, was epidemic among Victorian children, but also affected adults. The combination of spending all their time indoors to avoid tanning and covering every inch of their skin when they did go outside meant that Victorian women got almost no sun exposure. Vitamin D deficiency causes bone weakness, muscle pain, and fatigue. Many Victorian women had subtly deformed skeletons from childhood rickets that persisted into adulthood. Iron deficiency anemia was almost universal among Victorian women. The combination of heavy menstrual bleeding, caused by poor reproductive health, and inadequate dietary iron meant that most women were chronically anemic. Symptoms include extreme fatigue, weakness, pale skin, and difficulty concentrating. Victorian women were praised for their pale, delicate appearance. Never mind that this pallor was a sign of severe anemia, rather than fashionable beauty. The fashionable eating disorder of the Victorian era was called the green sickness, or chlorosis. It primarily affected young women and was characterized by pale greenish skin, weakness, shortness of breath, and irregular menstruation. Modern doctors believe chlorosis was actually iron deficiency anemia, possibly combined with other nutritional deficiencies. But Victorian doctors treated it with bloodletting and rest, which only made the condition worse. Some Victorian women took this fashionable frailty to extremes and deliberately made themselves ill through fasting or ingesting vinegar, which was believed to make the skin pale and suppress appetite. The vinegar craze was particularly dangerous because the acetic acid could damage the esophagus and stomach lining, leading to chronic digestive problems. The combination of malnutrition, toxic cosmetics, lack of hygiene, and restrictive clothing created a vicious cycle. The poorer a woman's health became, the more she relied on cosmetics to hide her sickly appearance. The more cosmetics she used, the sicker she became. The sicker she became, the more fashionably pale and delicate she appeared. The more fashionable she appeared, the more other women tried to emulate her, and so the cycle continued, with each generation of Victorian women becoming progressively less healthy. But wait, there's more. Because we haven't even discussed the household environment that Victorian women lived in. Remember those warnings about miasma and night air? The Victorian obsession with avoiding drafts and keeping windows closed created indoor environments that were toxic in their own right. Victorian homes were heated with coal fires, which produced tremendous amounts of soot and smoke. Much of this smoke was vented through chimneys, but not all. Victorian parlours were often hazy with smoke, and the walls and ceilings would become coated with a layer of black soot. This soot contained a variety of toxic substances, including sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and various heavy metals. The furniture and decorations added to the toxic environment. Victorians loved wallpaper, and Victorian wallpaper often contained arsenic. Not just a little bit of arsenic, either. We're talking about wallpapers that were so toxic they could kill you. The most notorious was a shade called Scheele's green, a vibrant emerald green that was created using copper arsenite. When Scheele's green wallpaper got damp, which happened frequently in poorly ventilated Victorian homes, moulds would grow on it. These moulds would convert the copper arsenite into trimethylarsine gas, a toxic vapor that would fill the room. People living in rooms with arsenic wallpaper would experience headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing, and gradual arsenic poisoning. Several deaths were attributed to arsenic wallpaper, but the product remained popular for decades because it was so fashionable. The dyes used in Victorian clothing and fabrics were also frequently toxic. Many dress fabrics were coloured with arsenic-based dyes, particularly greens and blues. Women wearing these dresses would absorb arsenic through their skin, adding to their toxic burden. When they sweated, which they did frequently under all those layers, the arsenic would dissolve in the sweat and be absorbed even more efficiently. The carpets and draperies in Victorian homes were heavy, thick, and almost never cleaned properly. Remember, this was before vacuum cleaners. Carpets were occasionally beaten to remove some of the surface dust, but the deep cleaning required to actually remove accumulated dirt and debris was rarely done. Victorian carpets became repositories for decades' worth of dust, hair, skin cells, and various other unpleasant substances. This accumulation of organic matter created perfect breeding grounds for dust mites, which are microscopic arachnids that feed on dead skin cells. Dust mite allergies cause sneezing, coughing, itchy eyes, and respiratory problems. Many Victorian women suffered from chronic respiratory issues that were attributed to weak constitutions or hysteria, but were actually allergic reactions to the clouds of dust mites living in their carpets. The cleaning products used in Victorian homes were often as toxic as the cosmetics. Ammonia, lye, and various harsh acids were used to clean everything from floors to dishes. These chemicals, when used in poorly ventilated spaces, could cause respiratory irritation, chemical burns, and poisoning. Servants, who did most of the actual cleaning, often suffered from chronic respiratory problems and skin conditions from exposure to these harsh chemicals. The gas lighting that illuminated Victorian homes in the evening was another source of toxicity. Gas lamps burned coal gas, which produced carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and various other toxic fumes. The lamps were supposed to be properly ventilated, but in practice, many homes had poorly maintained gas lines that leaked, filling the rooms with toxic gases. Carbon monoxide poisoning causes headaches, dizziness, confusion, and in severe cases, death. Many Victorian mysterious deaths were probably carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty gas lines. The water supply in Victorian cities was contaminated with sewage, industrial waste, and various other pollutants. The Great Stink of 1858, when the smell from the Thames River became so bad that Parliament had to be suspended, was caused by raw sewage being dumped directly into the river. This was the same river that supplied drinking water to much of London. Cholera epidemics were common in Victorian cities. The disease is caused by a bacterium found in contaminated water and causes severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. It can kill within hours if left untreated. The connection between contaminated water and cholera wasn't fully understood until the 1850s, and even then, many cities were slow to improve their water supplies. Women who survived the various other hazards of Victorian life could easily be killed by a simple glass of water. The combination of poor sanitation, contaminated water, and lack of basic hygiene created perfect conditions for disease to spread. Typhoid fever, dysentery, and various other waterborne diseases were endemic in Victorian cities. The medical treatment available to Victorian women was often worse than the diseases it was meant to cure. Bloodletting. The practice of deliberately opening a vein to drain blood from a patient was still common in the early Victorian period. The theory was that many diseases were caused by an excess of blood, and removing some of this blood would restore balance to the body. In reality, bloodletting just made sick people weaker. A patient already suffering from anemia, malnutrition, and toxic exposure would be bled, losing even more of their limited blood supply. They would become weaker, paler, and more confused. Doctors would interpret this as evidence that the disease was progressing and would often prescribe more bloodletting. The patient would get progressively weaker until they either recovered on their own, which their healthy bodies occasionally managed despite the medical intervention, or died, which happened frequently. Leeches were used for more localized bloodletting. The theory was that applying leeches to a specific area would draw out bad blood and cure local ailments. In practice, leeches introduced bacteria into the wound, risked infection, and weakened the patient through blood loss. But they were considered a sophisticated medical treatment, so doctors continued to prescribe them well into the Victorian era. Purging and emetics were another common treatment. If bloodletting was meant to remove bad blood, Purging was meant to remove bad substances from the digestive system. Doctors would prescribe powerful laxatives or emetics, substances that induced vomiting, to cleanse the body. Patients would spend days vomiting and experiencing diarrhea, losing fluids and becoming severely dehydrated. This was considered therapeutic. The medications prescribed by Victorian doctors were often dangerous or useless. Mercury was prescribed for everything from syphilis to teething problems in infants. Opium and its derivatives, including laudanum and morphine, were freely available and widely prescribed for pain, anxiety, insomnia, and even coughs. Many Victorian women became addicted to opium-based medications without realizing it, because the addictive nature of these drugs wasn't fully understood. Patent medicines, sold without prescription, and making outrageous claims about their curative properties, were wildly popular. These concoctions often contained alcohol, opium, mercury, arsenic, or cocaine. They provided temporary symptom relief, mostly by getting the user intoxicated or high, but did nothing to address the underlying health problems. Many Victorian women were functional addicts, depending on their daily dose of patent medicine to get through the day. The combination of toxic environment, poor nutrition, lack of hygiene, restrictive clothing, dangerous cosmetics, and ineffective medical treatment created a population of chronically ill women. They were pale, weak, prone to fainting, and in constant pain. Their hair was falling out, their teeth were rotting, and their skin was covered in rashes and lesions. They trembled from mercury-induced nerve damage, struggled to breathe in their corsets, and suffered from chronic infections that were never properly treated. And yet, Victorian society looked at these suffering women and praised them as the ideal of feminine beauty. The pale, delicate, fragile lady who needed to rest frequently and couldn't exert herself without fainting was held up as the model all women should aspire to. The fact that this ideal could only be achieved through self-destruction was either not recognized or not considered important. The lower classes had their own set of hygiene-related problems. Working-class women couldn't afford the expensive toxic cosmetics used by the wealthy, which ironically may have saved their lives. But they faced different challenges. Factory work exposed them to toxic chemicals, dangerous machinery, and brutal working conditions. Domestic servants worked 16-hour days in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in coal smoke and cleaning product fumes. Working-class homes were crowded, poorly ventilated, and rarely cleaned. Multiple families might share a single room, with no running water and only communal outdoor toilets. Bathing was impossible in these conditions. A working-class woman might go months without a proper wash, not from choice, but from sheer lack of facilities. The diseases that thrived in these conditions were brutal. Tuberculosis, also known as consumption, was the leading cause of death in Victorian England. It's caused by a bacterium that spreads through the air when an infected person coughs or sneezes. In crowded, poorly ventilated homes, tuberculosis spread like wildfire. The disease causes coughing, weight loss, fever, and night sweats. Victims would waste away slowly over months or years, coughing up blood and struggling to breathe. The romantic Victorian notion of the consumptive beauty, pale and ethereal, was based on actual dying women. The disease caused weight loss and extreme pallor that fit Victorian beauty standards, so suffering from tuberculosis was sometimes seen as making a woman more beautiful and delicate. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Victorian beauty culture. Actual symptoms of deadly disease were considered attractive. Typhus was another disease of poverty and poor hygiene. It's spread by body lice, which thrive in unwashed clothes and bedding. Typhus causes high fever, headache, and a characteristic rash. In severe cases, it leads to confusion, organ failure, and death. Typhus epidemics were common in Victorian slums, where people lived in such crowded, filthy conditions that body lice infestations were universal. Cholera, as mentioned earlier, was spread through contaminated water, but it also spread through poor personal hygiene. The bacterium is present in the feces of infected individuals, and in conditions where people didn't wash their hands after using the toilet or before handling food. Cholera could spread rapidly. A single infected person in a crowded tenement could trigger an outbreak that killed dozens. Working class women who did manage to improve their circumstances faced new dangers. As they moved up the social ladder, they began adopting the beauty practices of the middle class, including the toxic cosmetics. But because they couldn't afford the expensive lead-based products used by the wealthy, they often bought cheaper versions that were even more dangerous. Street vendors sold homemade cosmetics that were essentially toxic waste in decorative pots. These products might contain lead stolen from old paint, mercury scavenged from broken thermometers, or arsenic bought as rat poison. The concentrations of these toxins were often much higher than in legitimate cosmetics, and the products were contaminated with various other substances. Women who used these bargain cosmetics poisoned themselves even more rapidly than their wealthy counterparts. The prostitution trade in Victorian England added another layer of horror to the story of women's health. Prostitutes, who made up a significant portion of the female population in Victorian cities, faced all the health hazards of poverty, plus the additional risks of their profession. Sexually transmitted diseases were epidemic. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections were rampant among sex workers and their clients. Syphilis deserves special attention because its progression is particularly horrific. The disease starts with a painless sore at the site of infection. If left untreated, it progresses to a secondary stage involving rashes and fever. Years later, the tertiary stage begins, and this is where things get truly nightmarish. Tertiary syphilis attacks the brain, heart, and other organs, causing dementia, paralysis, blindness, and eventually death. The treatment for syphilis in Victorian times was mercury. Doctors would prescribe mercury pills, mercury ointments to be rubbed on the skin, or mercury fumigation, where the patient would sit in a sealed box while mercury was heated below them, breathing in the toxic fumes. The theory was that mercury would cure syphilis. The reality was that mercury poisoning was almost as bad as the disease itself. Prostitutes treated for syphilis would experience the symptoms of mercury poisoning: tremors, tooth loss, personality changes, and organ damage. They were being poisoned in an attempt to cure a disease, and in many cases, the treatment killed them before the disease could. But at least the mercury gave them that fashionable pale, delicate look before they died. The lack of effective birth control meant that Victorian women were essentially at the mercy of their fertility. Middle and upper class women might have 5, 10, or even 15 pregnancies over the course of their reproductive years. Each pregnancy took a tremendous toll on their already compromised health. Remember, these women were malnourished, poisoned by cosmetics, suffering from chronic infections, and wearing corsets that deformed their internal organs. Pregnancy itself was dangerous enough in the Victorian era. Prenatal care was minimal. Doctors weren't sure how to manage most pregnancy complications, and there were no ultrasounds, blood tests, or other modern diagnostic tools. Women just had to hope that everything would go well and pray that they would survive childbirth. Childbirth in Victorian England was a leading cause of death for women. The maternal mortality rate was approximately 1 in 100 births, which doesn't sound terrible until you remember that women were having multiple children. A woman who had 10 children had a roughly 10% chance of dying in childbirth at some point. And those are just the deaths. Many more women survived childbirth but suffered serious complications. Puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, was a major killer. It's an infection of the reproductive tract that occurs after childbirth, caused by bacteria introduced during delivery. In the Victorian era, when doctors didn't understand germ theory and didn't wash their hands between patients, puerperal fever was common. Symptoms include fever, abdominal pain, and eventually septic shock. It kills within days if left untreated, and Victorian doctors had no effective treatments. The problem was particularly bad in hospitals. where doctors would go directly from performing autopsies on women who had died of puerperal fever to delivering babies, spreading the infection from patient to patient. One Hungarian doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, figured out in the 1840s that washing hands with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced puerperal fever deaths. His colleagues mocked him, rejected his findings, and continued to deliver babies with unwashed hands. Semmelweis had a nervous breakdown from the frustration of watching women die needlessly, and was eventually committed to an asylum, where he died of sepsis after being beaten by guards. Victorian medicine at its finest. The women who survived childbirth faced a long, difficult recovery. The standard advice was to stay in bed for weeks after delivery, which sounds restful, but actually led to blood clots, muscle atrophy, and other complications. Many women developed chronic pelvic pain, urinary incontinence, or fistulas, which are abnormal connections between organs that can cause urine or feces to leak uncontrollably. These conditions were devastating and often impossible to treat. Breastfeeding, which is beneficial for both mother and child, was discouraged among the upper classes. Wealthy women hired wet nurses to breastfeed their babies, because breastfeeding was considered somewhat vulgar and would interfere with social obligations. This meant that wealthy women didn't get the health benefits of breastfeeding, including reduced risk of breast cancer and faster postpartum recovery. It also meant their babies didn't get the antibodies present in breast milk and were more likely to die of infections. The wet nurses, usually poor women who had recently had babies of their own, would breastfeed multiple infants, while often not having enough nutrition for themselves. Their own babies might be weaned early or fed inadequate substitutes, so that the wet nurse could sell her milk to wealthy families. This created a cascade of suffering, with poor infants being malnourished so that wealthy infants could be fed, and the wet nurses themselves becoming exhausted and ill from the constant demands on their bodies. Infant mortality in Victorian England was staggering. In some working-class neighbourhoods, nearly half of all children died before their 5th birthday. The causes were numerous infections, malnutrition, accidents, and in some cases infanticide. But one often overlooked cause was the mother's poor health. Malnourished, anemic, poisoned mothers couldn't produce adequate breast milk. Their babies would fail to thrive, becoming weak and susceptible to any passing infection. The children who survived infancy often grew up in the same toxic environment that was destroying their mother's health. Young girls were dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing, complete with corsets. Some doctors recommended that girls start wearing corsets as young as 3 or 4 years old to train their bodies into the proper shape. These child corsets would deform their growing skeletons, leading to spinal problems, restricted organ development, and chronic pain that would last their entire lives. Young Victorian girls were also introduced to cosmetics at a surprisingly young age. Teenagers would begin using the same lead-based powders and mercury-based rouge as their mothers, poisoning themselves before they even reached adulthood. By the time these girls were old enough to marry, they might already be suffering from the early symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, fatigue, weakness, and difficulty concentrating. The educational system for girls, such as it was, didn't help matters. Middle and upper class girls were educated in accomplishments like music, drawing, and needlework rather than anything practical. They were taught to be decorative rather than functional. Physical education was almost non-existent, because exertion was considered unfeminine and potentially dangerous for girls' delicate constitutions. This lack of physical activity, combined with restrictive clothing and poor nutrition, meant that Victorian girls grew up weak and unfit. Their muscles never developed properly. Their hearts and lungs never learned to work efficiently. By the time they reached adulthood, many Victorian women couldn't walk more than a short distance without becoming exhausted. Not because of any inherent feminine weakness, but because they had been systematically prevented from developing normal physical fitness. The emotional and psychological toll of Victorian womanhood was equally devastating. Women were expected to be cheerful, pleasant, and accommodating at all times, regardless of how they actually felt. Expressing anger, frustration, or ambition was considered unfeminine and inappropriate. Women who complained about their circumstances or pushed back against social expectations were labeled as hysterical or difficult. This constant suppression of genuine emotions, combined with chronic physical illness and pain, led to widespread mental health problems. Depression was endemic among Victorian women, though it was rarely diagnosed as such. Women suffering from depression were told they were suffering from weak nerves or hysteria, and were prescribed rest, isolation, and in some cases, institutionalization. The treatment for mental illness in Victorian England was barbaric. Asylums were essentially prisons where mentally ill people were locked away and forgotten. Patients were subjected to cold baths, restraints, isolation, and in some cases, physical abuse. The theory was that harsh treatment would shock patients back to sanity. In reality, asylum stays often made mental illness worse. Many women were committed to asylums for reasons that had nothing to do with actual mental illness. A woman who defied her husband, who was too sexually enthusiastic or not enthusiastic enough, who wanted to work or pursue education, or who was simply inconvenient, could be declared insane and institutionalized. Once in an asylum, it was nearly impossible to get out. These women would spend years or even decades locked away, their lives destroyed by a system that saw female independence as a form of insanity. The few women who did manage to break free of Victorian gender expectations faced tremendous social pressure and ostracism. Women who worked in professions were viewed with suspicion. Women who remained unmarried were pitied or scorned. Women who advocated for social change were mocked, harassed, and sometimes physically attacked. The early feminist movements in Victorian England fought for basic rights: the right to own property, the right to vote, the right to education, and the right to control their own bodies. They faced fierce opposition from men and women alike. The prevailing belief was that women were naturally inferior to men, intellectually and physically, and that attempting to change this natural order was both futile and dangerous. Part of the justification for women's inferior status was their supposed fragility and weakness. But as we've seen, Victorian women weren't naturally weak. They were made weak by their clothing, their diet, their cosmetics, and their entire way of life. The Victorian ideal of femininity required women to be helpless and dependent, and Victorian society went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that women actually became helpless and dependent. The toxic beauty culture was perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system. It convinced women that their value lay in their appearance, and that achieving the proper appearance required sacrifice and suffering. Women willingly poisoned themselves, starved themselves, and confined themselves in restrictive clothing because they believed this was necessary to be beautiful and therefore valuable. The cosmetics industry, the fashion industry, and the medical establishment all profited from this system. Cosmetics companies sold toxic products at inflated prices. Fashion designers created ever more restrictive and uncomfortable clothing. Doctors treated the symptoms of poisoning and malnutrition without addressing the root causes, ensuring a steady stream of patients. And society as a whole benefited from keeping women weak and dependent. Women who were chronically ill, in constant pain, and struggling just to get through the day, didn't have the energy to demand political rights, economic independence, or social change. They were too busy trying to breathe in their corsets and hiding the symptoms of lead poisoning under another layer of makeup. Lasted from 1837 to 1901. More than 60 years, during which multiple generations of women were subjected to this systematic destruction of their health. The women who were girls when Victoria took the throne were grandmothers by the time she died, and they had spent their entire lives poisoning themselves in the name of beauty. The long-term effects of this cultural madness are difficult to fully quantify. We know that life expectancy for Victorian women was significantly lower than for men, despite the fact that women naturally tend to outlive men. We know that chronic illness was so common among Victorian women that it was considered normal. We know that mental illness, addiction, and suicide were all significant problems. What we don't know is how many women died prematurely from cosmetic poisoning. How many were rendered chronically ill? How many suffered brain damage from lead exposure? And how many were driven to madness by mercury? The deaths were rarely attributed to cosmetics. Women who died young were said to have died of consumption, hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or simply, or decline. The role of toxic beauty products in these deaths was rarely acknowledged. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the tide began to turn. The development of germ theory and better understanding of disease transmission led to improvements in sanitation and hygiene. The Pure Food and Drug Acts in various countries began to regulate cosmetics and medications, banning the most toxic ingredients. Women's suffrage movements gained strength, and women began to demand better treatment and more autonomy. But the change was slow. Lead-based cosmetics weren't fully banned in many countries until the 1920s or later. Mercury-based products remained available even longer. Corsets gradually went out of fashion, but restrictive and unhealthy beauty practices continued in different forms. The fundamental idea that women should suffer for beauty remained entrenched in the culture. The Victorian era represents one of the most extreme examples of how cultural ideals of beauty can become literally toxic. But the underlying problem hasn't gone away. Modern women still face pressure to meet unrealistic beauty standards. Modern cosmetics are generally safer than Victorian products. But the beauty industry still profits from women's insecurities and still occasionally puts products on the market that turn out to be harmful. The specific practices have changed, but the mentality persists that women's value lies in their appearance, that achieving beauty requires sacrifice, and that it's acceptable for women to damage their health in pursuit of an idealized look. We've replaced lead with Botox, mercury with chemical peels, and arsenic with extreme dieting, but the fundamental transaction remains the same: trade your health for beauty, and maybe society will value you. The story of Victorian women and their toxic beauty practices is a cautionary tale. It shows us what happens when society values women's appearance over their health, when profit is prioritized over safety, and when women are systematically denied the information and autonomy they need to protect themselves. It shows us how normalized suffering can become when everyone is participating in the same destructive behaviors. But it also shows us something else: the incredible resilience of women who survived and even thrived despite everything their culture did to destroy them. Victorian women lived in houses full of arsenic, wore clothes soaked in toxic dyes, painted their faces with poison, starved themselves, compressed their organs, and breathed polluted air. And yet some of them still managed to write novels, advance science, fight for social change, and raise children. The fact that any Victorian women survived to old age is testament to human resilience. The fact that they managed to accomplish anything beyond simply staying alive is extraordinary. They were functioning with lead and mercury coursing through their veins, their organs displaced by corsets, their lungs damaged by pollution and tight lacing, their brains starved of oxygen and nutrients. They should have been barely functional, and yet Victorian women ran households, managed businesses, created art, and slowly, persistently worked to change the system that was destroying them. The suffragettes who fought for women's right to vote were probably poisoned by their cosmetics. The women who wrote about social reform were probably anemic and malnourished. The women who pushed for better working conditions were probably suffering from the effects of toxic cosmetics and restrictive clothing. They were fighting for change while their own bodies were slowly being destroyed by their culture. And they won, eventually. The Victorian era ended. Beauty standards shifted, and women gained more rights and autonomy. The most toxic cosmetics were banned, corsets went out of fashion, and women gained access to better healthcare, education, and opportunities. The change didn't happen overnight, and we're still dealing with the legacy of Victorian attitudes toward women's bodies and beauty. But change did happen, driven by women who refused to accept that suffering was the price of femininity. The Victorian era teaches us to be skeptical of beauty standards that require pain or sacrifice. It teaches us to question who profits when women are convinced they need to buy products or undergo treatments to be acceptable. It teaches us that what society calls beautiful might actually be symptoms of illness or poisoning. And it teaches us that women's health and autonomy should never be sacrificed for appearance, fashion, or anyone's idea of ideal femininity. When we look at photographs of Victorian women, with their impossibly tiny waists, their pale faces, and their delicate, frail appearances, we should remember that we're looking at poisoning victims. Those pale faces were pale from anemia and lead poisoning. Those tiny waists were achieved through organ compression. That delicate fragility was weakness from malnutrition and chronic illness. We're looking at women who were slowly being killed by their beauty routine and who were praised for their appearance, even as they were dying. The Victorian era was a time of tremendous scientific and technological advancement. Railways crisscrossed the country. Telegraphs connected the world. Photography preserved images, and medicine made genuine breakthroughs in understanding disease. But while all this progress was happening, women were still painting their faces with lead, lacing themselves into corsets, and dying from completely preventable causes. It's easy to look back at Victorian women and wonder how they could have been so foolish, how they could have willingly poisoned themselves and subjected themselves to such obvious harm. But the women of the time were working with the information they had, shaped by the cultural values they were raised with, and facing enormous pressure to conform. They were told by doctors that bathing was dangerous, by beauty experts that lead and mercury were safe, and by society that their appearance was more important than their health. We like to think we're more enlightened now, that we would never fall for such obvious scams or subject ourselves to such clear dangers. But every era has its own forms of accepted harm, its own toxic beauty standards, its own ways of convincing women that they need to damage themselves to be valuable. The Victorian era is just particularly easy to see from our vantage point because the harm was so obvious and so extreme. The walking zombies of Victorian England weren't created by any supernatural force. They were created by a beauty industry that put profit over safety, a medical establishment that ignored obvious harm, and a society that valued women's appearance over their lives. They were created by cultural standards that required women to be weak, dependent, and decorative rather than healthy, strong, and autonomous. And in the end, the real horror isn't the lead, or the mercury, or the arsenic. The real horror is that society looked at these poisoned, suffering women and called them beautiful. The real horror is that women were praised for symptoms of illness and poisoning, that weakness was considered attractive, that being barely able to function was seen as feminine and proper. The real horror is that women were convinced to destroy themselves, and everyone around them encouraged it. The Victorian era ended over a century ago, but its lessons remain relevant. Anytime beauty requires sacrifice, anytime fashion requires pain, anytime society tells women their appearance is more important than their health or autonomy, we should remember the Victorian women who painted their faces with poison and called it beauty. We should remember the women who couldn't breathe in their corsets and called it fashion. We should remember the women who starved themselves and called it delicate. And we should remember that they weren't stupid or vain or foolish. They were victims of a system that valued their appearance over their humanity, their decorative quality over their health, and their compliance over their survival. They were doing what they thought they had to do to be accepted, valued, and loved in a society that made those things conditional on meeting impossible and toxic standards. The story of Victorian women and their toxic beauty practices is ultimately a story about power, who has it, who doesn't, and what happens when people without power are convinced that the path to value lies in self-destruction. It's about how easily normalized harm becomes when everyone participates in it, when it's profitable for powerful interests, and when questioning it means being labeled difficult or hysterical. It's a story that should make us uncomfortable because it asks us to examine our own beauty practices, our own standards, our own willingness to harm ourselves for acceptance. It asks us to consider what future generations will think when they look back at our era and what we did to our bodies in the name of beauty. And it asks us to think about what we're teaching the next generation about where their value lies and what they should be willing to sacrifice for it. The Victorian women who painted their faces with lead, compressed their organs with corsets, and slowly poisoned themselves with arsenic didn't die in vain, if we learn from their story. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it teaches us to question beauty standards that require harm, to prioritize health over appearance, and to value women as human beings rather than decorative objects. So the next time you see a Victorian photograph of a pale, delicate woman with a tiny waist and a fragile appearance, remember you're not looking at natural beauty or ideal femininity. You're looking at a poisoning victim, a survivor of cultural violence, a woman who was told that destroying herself was the price of being valued. And remember that she deserves better than to have her suffering romanticized or her appearance idealized. She deserves to be remembered as she was, a human being who lived in an era that systematically destroyed women's health, and who survived despite everything her culture did to kill her. That's the real story of Victorian women and their disgusting personal hygiene turned walking zombies. Not a tale of delicate femininity, but a horror story about what happens when society decides that women's appearance is more important than their lives.